The house was quiet, except for the ticking clock on the wall and the soft hum of the fridge. The silence felt strange, so different from the usual busy life of the Adebayo family. Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo worked hard, doing their best to build a good future for their only child in a foreign country. Both had long, tiring jobs, trying to keep up with the demands of their new life far from home in Africa. Their son, Junior, sat slouched on the couch, eyes fixed on a tablet. He was 12, an age when boys start to figure out who they are. But Junior was stuck between two worlds, his parents' traditional ways and the fast-paced life around him. To his parents, he seemed to be drifting away from the values they held dear. "We need help," Mrs. Adebayo said one evening, her voice tired. "We can't do this alone." Her husband nodded, deep lines forming on his face. "We need someone from home, someone who understands our ways. That's the only way." And so they made a plan. Letters were sent, calls were made. A few weeks later, a girl from their village arrived at the airport, clutching a small, worn-out suitcase. Her name was Amina. She was 18, shy and respectful, which quickly made the Adebayos like her. She was brought in to help around the house, guide Junior, and bring back the values his parents feared he was losing, all this while furthering her studies online. At first, Amina seemed like a blessing. She was quiet, hardworking, and eager to please. She cooked, cleaned, and made sure Junior was ready for school. The house felt more organized than it had in years. Even the neighbors noticed the difference and praised the Adebayos for having such a well-kept home. But as weeks turned into months, little things began to change. Amina, once shy and obedient, started to push limits. She spent hours on her phone, whispered with Junior in corners, and began ignoring the rules. Junior, who had first disliked her presence, now followed her everywhere. They became close, laughing together, shutting the parents out. The Adebayos, too busy with work, missed the warning signs, the missing money, the unexplained detentions, and the slow change in Junior's attitude. Amina also started showing disrespect, rolling her eyes when asked to do chores or replying rudely to Mrs. Adebayo's requests. The truth finally came out one afternoon when Mr. Adebayo arrived home earlier than expected. He stepped into the house expecting the usual quiet, but instead his eyes landed on Junior and Amina, huddled in a corner. Their guilty expressions froze him in place. His heart pounded as he took in the scene. They were too close, too familiar. Something was wrong, something he should not have seen and never imagined he would ever witness. His breath caught in his throat. Amina was older, supposed to be a guide, a protector. Junior was still a child. Who had influenced who? Who had crossed the line first? A storm of emotions crashed through him. Anger, disbelief, guilt, confusion. His stomach twisted. He wanted to look away, to pretend he had misunderstood, but the truth was right in front of him, undeniable. Silence stretched across the room like a thick fog. Then his voice cut through it, low but shaking with fury. "What is going on here?" Neither answered. Junior stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Amina's wide eyes darted around, searching for an escape, her body tense like a trapped animal. The air grew heavier, suffocating. "This ends now," Mr. Adebayo's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. "Do you hear me? Both of you will face the consequences." Junior's head snapped up, his eyes burning with defiance. "You can't do anything to us," he spat, his voice sharp and full of challenge. The words hit like a slap. Mr. Adebayo felt a cold fear creeping in. This was not his son. This was not the boy he had raised, Junior stood tall, rebellious, unshaken by guilt, and Amina, the girl they had welcomed into their home, stood silently beside him, her expression unreadable. Mr. Adebayo clenched his fists, his vision blurred with frustration and pain. He had to act, but how? Every option before him felt like walking into a trap. He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. His next steps had to be careful. He could not afford to lose control. That night, he did not go to work. Instead, he waited for Mrs. Adebayo to come home. He sat in the dimly lit living room, his mind racing. The moment she stepped through the door, he stood up, his face grave. She could see something was wrong before he even spoke. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had seen. The Adebayo home would never be the same again. The tension in the house grew worse, thick like a storm waiting to break. Mr. Adebayo's anger lingered like a dark cloud over everything, casting a shadow over every interaction. Junior and Amina, though quieter, became more defiant. They had tasted power, and they intended to sit in it, emboldened by their ability to shake the foundation of their home. Junior changed before his parents' eyes. Once polite and obedient, he now moved with a careless arrogance that made his father's blood boil. He smirked instead of answering when spoken to, rolled his eyes at rules that once guided him, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Amina, too, had transformed. She no longer acted like a guest in the house, but rather like someone who had taken ownership of it. She walked freely, spoke sharply, and met Mrs. Adebayo's gaze with a coldness that had never been there before. The small misbehaviors grew into bigger problems. Junior skipped school more often, staying out for hours without explanation. When he returned, his excuses were flimsy, but Amina backed them up with such smooth conviction that it left no room for argument. Things around the house began to disappear. Jewelry, money from the kitchen counter, small valuables that were once safely tucked away. When Mrs. Adebayo confronted Amina, the girl would break down, sobbing apologies, promising change, but nothing ever improved. The missing items never returned, and the defiance only grew. The whispers between Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo at night turned into loud, frustrated arguments. The strain in the house was suffocating, yet they hesitated to act. Fear gripped them, fear of pushing too hard, fear of what Junior and Amina might do next. Finally, Mr. Adebayo had enough. One evening, he called a family meeting. He sat at the head of the dining table, his jaw tight with frustration. Mrs. Adebayo stood off to the side, wringing her hands. "This cannot continue," he said, his voice firm. "We brought Amina here to help, not to ruin our family. Junior, you were raised better than this. Don't let your surroundings tell you who you are. And Amina," he turned to her, his voice turning sharp, "we trusted you. Is this how you repay us?" Amina lowered her head, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. Junior, however, sat tall, crossing his arms over his chest. "You always blame us," he snapped. "Maybe if you weren't always working, you'd actually know what's going on." Mrs. Adebayo let out a quiet gasp, but her husband held up a hand. His grip on the edge of the table was white-knuckled. "I work to provide for this family. Everything I do is for you, for all of us. But if this is how you repay me, then it's time for consequences." "What consequences?" Junior sneered, his tone mocking. "I dare you to touch me or her. I'll call the police. Let's see what happens." He threw a glance at Amina, who gave a small, knowing nod. Mr. Adebayo saw red. He pushed forward to slap Junior, but the boy had been waiting for it and moved just in time. The air between them crackled with unspoken fury, Mrs. Adebayo jumped between them, her voice shaking as she begged for calm. Junior and Amina stormed out of the house. An hour later, they returned with 2 officers. Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo sat frozen as the police asked questions, their presence a humiliating confirmation of how far things had spiraled. The night marked the beginning of a long and grueling investigation with Child Services. For a month, their home was scrutinized, their parenting questioned. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the case was dropped when the children's statements changed, leaving behind nothing but deep wounds and bitter resentment. From that day, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Mr. Adebayo spoke little. He watched instead. He spent long hours on the phone at night, speaking in hushed tones. Papers appeared on the kitchen counter, documents, itineraries, only to vanish just as quickly. When Mrs. Adebayo asked about them, he gave vague, measured answers. Months passed, and one evening their holiday plans were announced. "We're going home for Christmas," Mrs. Adebayo said at dinner. Junior and Amina exchanged a look but said nothing. The trip was framed as a chance to reconnect with their roots, but beneath the surface, Mr. Adebayo's true intentions remained hidden, waiting for the right moment to unfold. Their trip back home was long and quiet. When they arrived at Mr. Adebayo's brother's house, the family welcomed them warmly. The village, with its bright sun and happy chatter, felt different from their life abroad. For a while, Junior and Amina joined in, playing with cousins, helping around the house. Even Mr. Adebayo seemed lighter, smiling more. But it didn't last. One evening after dinner, Mr. Adebayo stood up. The room fell silent. "I have something important to say," he began. "Things have been hard for us in the diaspora, and I now see that I made mistakes." Junior and Amina glanced at each other, uneasy. "I brought Amina into our home to help, but it's clear this isn't working, and Junior, you have lost your way, so I have decided you will both stay here under my brother's care. This is not punishment, it is a chance to learn." Junior shot to his feet. "What? You can't do this." Amina's eyes widened in shock. Mrs. Adebayo's hands shook, but she said nothing. "This is final," Mr. Adebayo said. "You will stay here until you understand what family means." Chaos broke out. Junior shouted. Amina begged. Relatives murmured, some agreeing, others looking away. But Mr. Adebayo stood firm. "You will thank me one day," he said quietly. That night, Junior and Amina sat in silence, staring at the walls. Outside, the village carried on, unchanged. But for them, life would never be the same again. The Adebayo household is no longer the same. The echoes of voices raised in anger and the weight of unspoken words linger, stretching across the empty spaces left behind. Time moves forward, but it does not erase the questions, the choices, or the consequences that have led to this moment. Has Mr. Adebayo gone too far? Was his decision an act of tough love, or has he pushed his son away forever? Will the village experience help Junior find himself, or will it deepen the divide between him and his parents? And what about Amina? Has she learned anything? Or is this just another chapter in an ongoing struggle for control? The world they have built in the diaspora offers opportunity but demands sacrifice. In trying to shape a future for their son, Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo hold tightly to the past, only to watch it slip through their fingers. Junior and Amina learn to navigate a life of contradictions, one foot in the traditions of their parents and another in the uncharted territory of a culture that beckons with its own freedoms and burdens. Their departure is sudden, yet inevitable. In the village, far from the city's hum, They are no longer shielded by the comforts of modernity. Instead, they find themselves in a world where stories carry lessons and silence holds meaning. Here, identity is not something to be questioned, but something to be understood, passed down through generations, in gestures, rituals, and the firm but steady hands of those who have lived long enough to know. Back in the city, Mr. Adebayo sits in quiet reflection. The struggle for control, the desperate attempts to impose order, it has all led here. He has believed authority means protection, that discipline will mend the cracks forming beneath them. But in the end, power wielded without balance has only deepened the divide. The weight of his decisions settles over him like a shadow he cannot shake. The absence of Junior and Amina reshapes the home. Mrs. Adebayo moves through the house more slowly, her hands lingering on objects that once belonged to them, the air thick with the scent of memories too fresh to be forgotten. The nights stretch long, conversations reduced to measured words and heavy sighs. The silence is no longer a sign of peace, but of something left unresolved. Yet, even in the stillness, there is something else, an opportunity. Time, relentless as it is, allows for wounds to close, even if scars remain. Perhaps one day there will be understanding. Perhaps one day there will be forgiveness. The question is not whether redemption is possible, but whether they will all be willing to reach for it. The story is not over. It never truly is. Families fracture, but they also rebuild. Lessons are learned, but they are also relearned. What lies ahead remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. Every choice has led them here, and every choice from this moment will shape what comes next. What do you think? Was this the right decision? Will the past remain a wound, or will it become a lesson? As one chapter closes, another begins. The journey continues. Stay connected. Like, share, and subscribe to witness what unfolds next.